Well, welcome back, everybody. I hope you've all had your glasses filled and nibbled away at some pizza. Before we carry on, and I would really like some more thoughts and opinions from the floor, and I know there are a few hands that were raised that we didn't quite get to, but a couple of people have asked, could we do a little bit of clarification about exactly what we mean by this question? And so I think, Richard, you said you've agreed to...
Well, I'll give it a go. I mean, somebody asked me, what do we mean by ethics? And I think that what I meant by this was probably everyone in this room runs some sort of organisation, or they run themselves within some sort of ethical framework, which they are relatively familiar with. My contention is that you can continue to use that ethical framework, maybe with some slight read across to some of the situations in AI, without troubling yourself too much with these additional considerations of AI. And I think Chris's position is you probably can't do that, and that there are at least 6 reasons why AI has special properties, and you need to explicitly consider those 6 when making decisions. Is that a fair?
Yes.
reading?
I wasn't claiming all those 6, but yes.
Yeah, you were claiming 4 of the 6.
4 of the 6, yes. If you want a definition of ethics, I found about 70 different definitions.
We're all right for that, Chris.
You weren't planning to go home, were you? Let me stand, it's probably easier. The one I rather like is Henry Sidgwick, who was a moral philosopher in the 19th century. And in 1893 he wrote that ethics is the study of what is right, or what ought to be, so far as this depends upon the voluntary action of individuals, assuming that whatever we judge to be good, we implicitly judge to be something which we ought to bring into existence. And obviously the corollary is true too. Now, I think that works for our general ethical principles, which it is advocating, and I think it also works equally well for AI ethics, and we just need to identify where AI is different and therefore requires a different judgment and potentially requires different regulation. That follows, it's not automatic.
Excellent, I think that probably helps. Now, I did ask if anybody's got any particular point of view which might be pertinent for our charities, and whether you think this is different, or any of these questions have a different sort of answer for.
Well, I don't know if it will affect the charities or not. I just wanted to ask, what part does religion play in this? Because different religions may have different ethical views. So I just wanted to throw that in, and I'll get my coat, okay.
Nightmare question for an atheist.
How about you, Chris? What do you think about that one?
Well, I'm a practicing Jew, so it's a valid question for me. The ethics of Judaism, Christianity, Islam's a bit different, significantly different in some cases. Yes, they're built in, as it were, to the practice of the religion. I've yet to see and ask the rabbi question related to AI, but it may be out there. So, does religion play a part? Religion helps to inform your ethical viewpoint, I think, if you are an adherent. But I have yet to dwell on that issue. It's a really interesting question. Thank you.
Yeah, sorry to I was just thinking about Islamic finance and desperately trying to think whether there might be Islamic AI or Christian AI. And I just cannot, I'm just not clever enough to answer your question. Go and ask a religion. There's a very good Gresham professor of Divinity who would love you to give you an answer on that question.
Perhaps someone related to that. Question for Chris. Are you suggesting that AI ethics is unique in being different from general ethics, or are there such things as medical ethics, legal ethics, military ethics, in other words, different rules for different spheres of human endeavour?
Oh, undoubtedly the answer to that question is yes. For instance, the field of medical ethics is far more developed than IT ethics, and I think we have much to learn from them. Richard gave one example, there are many others. And if a doctor encounters an ethical issue, they have committees that they can resort to, certainly codes of ethics and so on. Whether AI ethics is another one like that, I'm not sure, because of course each of those domains that you instance, medical, military and so on, deploy AI. And undoubtedly in the military sphere it's different. AI, ethics don't come that high up the list, but they're still there. They're still there. So in a sense I think we've got a crosshatch issue. Perhaps they're in parallel compartments. I'm not sure. Interesting question. Is Lena allowed to ask a question?
She's allowed to have a point
Thank
of
you,
view.
Chris. I hope no one asked this question while I was outside the past couple of minutes, but I guess I'm particularly interested in what this means for the charity sector as a sector, and whether there's a specific dimension due to that. And I guess on the one hand, you could argue that charities are often mostly values-based organizations. They're governed by a mission, a vision, a trustee board. They're regulated by the Charities Commission. They are trying to work for the good, and they're generally sort of driven. I think values stand quite in high course for charities. Of course, that's not always the case, but let's say by and large. On the other hand, however, they serve the most vulnerable people often, and they have a lot to lose from something going wrong and from a scandal. They're often usually one scandal away from losing funding, from losing sort of faith from their beneficiaries. So, there's a particular, I guess, need for ethical consideration on the other hand. So where, if you were a charity chief executive thinking about AI, where would that leave you? What would you do?
I'd do nothing. I mean, that's my point. By which I mean, I would very much hope, and some people have denied this, but let me say, I would very much hope that a responsible charity, particularly working in a charged area where you're dealing with vulnerable people, already has a well-developed set of codes, practices, and ethical procedures. Because if they don't, I don't want to give them any money. I believe that with very, very minor adaptations, those already cover most of the deployments of AI that you could envisage in the next 20 years. That is my position.
I would agree with that to some extent, but to the extent that there are AI-specific ethical issues, then if charities are seeking to deploy AI in the service of their clients, users, not sure what the right word is, then they need to think about that. And specifically in the AI learning exchange, the reason that I volunteered to join it was that I thought that there were AI ethical issues and might be able to contribute to that thinking. So I think it behoves the chief executive to think about the issues, to assess whether there are any specific problems which might arise in their deployment of AI, and take it from there.
At the back. Oh, sorry. I'll come back to you afterwards. That's right.
So I'm still seeing AI slightly differently to other things in terms of the degree of abstraction of decision making from the human, the degree of opaqueness to the human of that decision making, and then the ability of that instrument to enact upon the decision, which is a cluster of characteristics which we have never seen before. The idea of a Russia automatically fires bullets back at you when something happens, that's a lie. That doesn't actually happen. There's a whole load of people in the way of those two things happening. But now we're in a situation where you can make that decision. So if we bring that back to the charity element, if you're a charity and you've subcontracted some of your work, for example, gathering funds, and that fund gathering organisation behaves unethically, you have a problem, but you're dealing with another human being. With AI, that decision making and that action is far, far away from you. And that's what I think the biggest challenge for ethics, for the charities, but in general is. And that's what makes ethics for AI different. We've abdicated responsibility in many cases because we don't know what's going on within the machine. And it will get worse as AI learns and evolves and gets more complex.
You may.
Give a bit? So it's a nicely put point. And in my mind, what I see is these two fixed points. One is the computer system over here, dumb computer system, following strict deterministic system, and over here are humans. And I see this continuum running from here to here, and along this continuum sits AI, and as we develop AI, it gets closer and closer to the human brain. Well, we already deal with humans. They're covered by all of your existing ethical practices. And we deal with children, and we deal with people who are not mentally well developed. We already cover all of them. And we certainly deal with computers. So my view is already covered, thanks very much. That's how I come to that position. Now, can I just say one tiny thing? Because I think there is something, we're not meant to agree, but but this debate was quite carefully thought out so that there would be quite a lot of common agreement, because only idiots think these things aren't closely balanced. They are closely balanced. There is an element which I think probably needs a little bit of thought, which is the learning, which you alluded to. How do these systems learn? And if they learn on the job, as it were, which they do, can you be confident that the machine you designed is the machine that you deployed? No, you can't. You absolutely cannot. Just as I cannot be confident that your children are as nice as you. They've been Philip Larkin, was at work with your children and other influences. But you already cover that. You're already able to cover these highly non-deterministic systems called humans.
So,
All I can say is I agree.
I promise Simon at the back. At the right. And then I'll come back over there.
I'm Simon, I'm from Samaritans, so we've got some code of ethics and we're grappling with AI type problems. The one I wanted to pick up on was impersonation, which you mentioned. So kind of coming from where I am, there's a program that I think was made in the 60s called ELIZA, that's a dumb
it's a Rogerian
computer
psychotherapist.
That's right, yeah. So it's some script that mimics that behaviour.
Yeah.
And people interact with this as though it's a real person, even though it can't pass the Turing test, and you tell them what it is, and they still interact with it like a human. So it looks to me like in this case there's kind of an ethical issue, which is about whether or not it's ethical to allow people to self-delude in this way. So they know it's not a real person, but it feels like there's a real person who cares about them, and that's good enough. And then whether or not it's kind of ethical to increase the perceived value of these systems, so it could feel even more like a human, and I could be even more deluded, but get even more value out of it. So is that I don't think that adds a new dimension, but I think, is that an ethical direction of travel? And then there's another sort of the other side of that is what happens when people become more familiar with interacting with AI. So if I spend all day talking to my nice therapist who doesn't reprimand me for my behaviour and just makes me feel good about myself, and then I have to go and interact with other people who don't like me as much, and respond to I've developed some behaviours in relation to these AIs, and then I've then got maladaptive behaviour for the kind of human world. Okay, so one way of avoiding this would be make a grumpy AI that's more like an upset human. But then we're just increasing the delusion factor, and so we've got to kind of make a choice about, do we want our AI to be more human and more like us, so that then if we are in a world of interaction with AI, we then take that into our interaction with humans and it's more of a balance, or do we really dehumanise the AI and then risk that we develop that as a mode of interaction with something that appears to be human? still don't think that it necessitates a different ethics, but I think there is a direction of travel thing going on. And I think that impersonation problem is one of the biggest ones. Charities who are being sold chatbots.
So I mean, there's a very interesting point. Eliza was this Rogerian psychotherapist, and I think a Rogerian psychotherapist always gives you, you say, I'm worried about my family, and it says, well, tell me about my mother, it's non-judgmental, and it just repeats stuff to you. Of course, before Eliza, humans were trained to say this. Was that ethical? And was it ethical to tell people that they were acting? It seems to me that these questions are all answerable when you say, well, let's imagine a human did it. So that's my sort of bottom line, which is, well, does the same issue arise with humans? If the answer is yes, then why don't I think about that situation?
Well, I guess my response would be like the human might get tired and stop talking to you all the time, but there's kind of a degree of I can sit in my
That's the
hand,
scale and speed argument, which is AI can keep going, keep propagating, and it never gives up.
I don't know if you ever get these phone calls from somebody who says, I understand that you've had an accident and it wasn't your fault. Well, they're bloody irritating. And if you respond, and I've taken to saying, yes, I had this terrible accident and I wasn't responsible, just to see what would happen. And actually, after about a minute and a half, it switches you to a human being. It was a robot. Now, is that unethical? I don't really care. It's just bloody irritating. But the fact that a human is being impersonated is an issue. And I think in general, it raises an ethical issue, not just a irritating Chris issue.
Simon, I wanted to come back.
I think the issue on this, and funnily enough, we're from the Brain Tumour Charity. I'm the trustee at the last trustees meeting. We were talking about this in the context of chatbots. For us, the principle is transparency, right? So, to gentlemen from the Samaritans, I think if you're being transparent, say, would you like to talk to a chatbot, a robot, and it can be very sympathetic and it will this, right? Or you can talk to a human, or if you put the person in control, as long as you're clear what you're doing, then I think, that transparency is there. That's important. And for us, we found that, this is Pippa's area more than mine, that some people actually want to talk to a chatbot because actually they can ask questions that they wouldn't feel comfortable talking to a human, right? Some very difficult questions and things about treatments and pathways and implications and all those things. And as long as you're clear that that's what it's doing, then for some people that's incredibly therapeutic and a key access to information. The other thing we're doing with the charity, as some of you know from the WCIT, is we're trying to capture, we have now about 10 million data points around brain tumour sufferers on 100,000 patients. And we do have to remember that it's only when you have very large volumes of high quality data that AI ever truly comes into its own. So we can talk about some of the challenges of AI. We're desperately trying to prove the case that better data over a longer period of time on more patients opens the door to finding patterns in whether it's genomes or DNA or proteins or tumour developments or imagery or wherever it might be. Wherever we can find data, we're going to take that data and try and use AI and other things to solve it. So it definitely has its power for good too.
That's good to bring us back down to earth, what we're really fighting for here. Somebody else got a point over here?
I'm from one of your new charities, and we run a helpline as well. And I was for the motion. I thought our ethics will cover everything until you started talking. So with our people, who I agree are definitely inconsistent, and some of them, we train them, we give them good training. You put them on the end of the call, and you just don't know what they're going to do. But we meet with them monthly, so we can pull them back in, and we can give them further training, we can support them. So if we put a chatbot in the beginning of that to try to help us with our demand, which is what we want to do, how can we, you don't have that ongoing training and...
You do. Yeah.
How? See, we're new.
Just
so
train and retrain.
Convince me. Bring me back to the green.
one way to think about this, I think, is that the chatbot you're using now will be completely antique and out of date in 18 months' time. So you will doubtless be recording as many interactions as you can with people and retraining using the latest technology and retraining and retraining and retraining. And the great advantage of doing that is at least you're doing it systematically. You're never really sure about the meat computer, you know, all of your people who work for you, that it actually doesn't go in one ear and comes out the other. You know, one of the great beauties of AI is that at least you if you control the inputs, then you can be fairly confident about the outputs.
Mm. Any other thoughts?
Yes, so the question I want to ask is at what point can the AI decide its own ethics? Because it sounds like at the moment you're sort of treating it like it's an animal and we decide what, you know, happens to an animal for the actions it takes, and it's different to human beings. But there's also an argument that something's, you know, intelligent enough that actually it can process whatever a country's ethics are and make its own decisions about how it's going to ethically behave within its environment, and for each person that's like nuancedly different. So you know, what's the point that tips?
There is work, you know, Richard's probably got a better answer than I have, but there is work going on at Oxford Brookes University on developing an AI ethic to try and inculcate, if that's the right word, into a machine ethical judgment. And the professor who's leading that work would say we may be able to mimic ethics, but we'll never get to ethics. So I say no.
I don't know the answer. Who is doing it? Is it Vilcloxing?
It's Nigel Chapel.
Anyway, sorry. So,
Nigel Cook.
when I don't know the answer to something, I've learned that you say 2050. So your question was when, so I say 2050. It's quite a long time away.
By which time I will be dead.
Yeah.
Brian. Oh, sorry, got following by the back.
I like the idea of a meat computer, which had me thinking. It suddenly made me think. So I'm sat between two of my trustees here. So if I'm a trustee and I have people on the support line, meat computers, giving support advice, and something goes horribly wrong, I can sit down with the meat computer and we can talk it through and understand what went wrong, why they took the decisions they took, and perhaps resolve that with the individual that felt they were wronged. If I have an AI chatbot, and I think there are examples where AI chatbots, when they've been exposed to real-world data, have kind of gone off the rails and started making strange decisions. It's not possible to sit down with the AI chatbot and get it to tell you why it did that. All you can really do is retrain it, starting from scratch with a new set of data. I think that raises an ethical question for trustees. Okay, trustees, so you knew that could happen. Why did you let that chatbot loose on our beneficiary community?
Okay, so
And I think that ethical question is different from the current code of ethics that we have as a charity.
okay, right. So I think I alluded to the fact I'm basically a utilitarian sort of ethicist at the beginning. So from my perspective, it's a perfectly legitimate question, and you have to balance the good and the bad. And the good is that presumably you've got very high capacity when you're deploying the AI and you can deal with a lot of people very fast. And the bad is you occasionally get these weird things that you don't understand. And you have to balance, I assume that is the balance that you have to, and if your code doesn't allow you to weigh those things, then it should, yeah, it should.
Well, I think we've got time for one last point of view, which is at the back there. Oh, sorry, and then Kimball. I can see you.
I was just wondering, could it be a case that we're probably conflating two separate things here, where AI is being applied to all world problems which have pre-existing ethical codes, and as such we should cast AI on within the light of those codes?
So we can't quite hear you, sir.
Sorry, could it be a case that we are conflicting two separate things? I'm just wondering, because Finton and I have been chatting about this for quite some time here behind it. Quite sorry about the noise. Where it is that it seems like AI more or less has been applied, we're trying to apply AI to a real world where we have old world problems. And these old world problems have their own specific ethical codes as per their problems that have been centuries old, to be quite frank. I've been trying to figure out, are there any truly AI-specific ethical codes? And the only thing I can think of, or ethical questions, are probably the internet, which is roughly 30 years old, give or take. Apart from that, every other thing is a question of ethics within that business vertical. So, for example, China's profiling of people, of the Uyghurs, I think it is, it's more or less a question of racial profiling, which is just wrong. That same application can be used to find people who are lost at sea in the Mediterranean, which is wonderful. So perhaps it is that there's no real answer to this. There's no real ethics behind AI in and of itself. But then if we start to apply it as a tool, which is what science, we're just providing another tool, we have to start to look at it within the realm of its being applied, I should say, applicability. Now, as for the question of the chatbots itself, that seems to be a new world problem, and in that case, it's really just about badly trained AI. And as the gentleman quite rightly said, it's a question of training this AI again and again and again. In that case, we shouldn't take it as an ethical question. It could be more a case of a scientific question, to be quite honest. Have we done our jobs right? I mean, I don't know.
That's really helpful. I think you've made quite a few points there. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask Chris and Richard to think about what you said, because they're going to start preparing their responses to everything they've heard. And I think you've encapsulated quite a few of the arguments tonight. So I thank you for that, and I think they probably thank you as they're thinking about what they say next. But have we got... Kimball, did I see you raise your hand? Is that something you'd like to...
I'm not sure it's the world's greatest closing.
Oh, well, we've just said something deep and meaningful, so...
It was picking up on Chris and this chap from Oxford Brookes looking to effectively to teach computers ethics. My question associated with that was, whose ethics? On the grounds that at the moment, I think the Russians may have a different view on AI than we do, for example. And will there or can there ever be an international code of ethics, full stop, or one that relates to AI specifically?
Thank you.
Shall I take that now? Or?
Well, as you wish. Do you want to take it now, or do you want
No,
to
happy to take it now. What he's trying to do is inculcate a British ethical code, for want of a better term. All he's succeeded in doing so far is using rewards and punishments. So he can train an AI the child that it is trying to serve, this is the model, likes cake. So if it gives the child cake, then that's good, and if it doesn't, that's bad. You would not recognise that as a high ethical code, and it's early days for the work. But when I discussed it with him, his name's Nigel Crook, and he's professor at AI at Oxford Brookes. He agreed that he didn't believe it was really going to be practical. So, undoubtedly, a Western view of ethics, but so far very limited.
Well, thank you all very much for your contributions, opinions and questions. They've all been, I think, very useful and really quite revealing in terms of what we've been talking about. And I know you've probably gathered by now, this is a very close kind of call between these two gentlemen. But in the way of these things, it's Chris's opportunity to give us a first response, followed by Richard, and then we'll be able to vote and see if we've changed your minds. Chris, how do you feel about that?
Fine. I don't think I could summarise the conversation. Excuse me. And in a sense, we've answered many of the questions, or responded. I'm not sure we've answered any of the questions. We've responded to the questions as we've been going along. I think what we've seen is a recognition that there are a number of different jurisdictions and ethical codes in different countries. And I don't believe there's ever going to be a solution to that one. We'll never develop an absolute code or impose our views on other countries. Nor probably should we even try. That doesn't, to my mind, mean that we shouldn't exercise our own judgment and seek to identify and elaborate codes of ethics, whether in the general case or in the AI specific case. Richard alluded to regulation. We don't want excessive regulation. I quite agree. Excessive regulation is a damper on development, on research, and so on. On the other hand, regulation is often necessary. I personally don't want to fly in unregulated aeroplanes or be treated by doctors in an unregulated medical environment. So we do recognise that there are situations where regulation is important and necessary, and the trick is that the regulation needs to be appropriate, it needs to be well thought out, and it needs not to be based on the latest technology. And there have been quite a few examples, for instance in microwave, where the government has regulated based on a current model of technology which within a very few years was out of date, and so the regulations were out of date. And there's a big risk of that taking place in AI. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't regulate. What it does mean is we need to think through very carefully what the ethical issues are and where regulation is truly necessary, and then construct the regulations appropriately. To take one example, the issue of product liability has depended since, I think it's 1998, on the European Product Liability Directive, which was a very good piece of regulation, which has stood the test of time. There have been some national disputes under it, very few international ones, which is evidence that it works. Now, the EU is currently conducting, the Commission is currently conducting a consultation as to whether it should change because of AI, and because actually it didn't even take software into account. Can software be a product? At the moment it isn't. Clearly, the software artifact nowadays we would regard as a product. And AI, the Commission has recognised, has its own very specific issues for the reasons we've been discussing this evening. So, early days yet, it's still an issue of consultation. But what that is evidence of, in my view, is that regulation may be needed, it needs to be carefully constructed, and it needs to be based on agreed ethical principles where appropriate. One or two other issues which came up. What part does religion play? Well, I'm certainly still thinking about that, and I'm going to ask the rabbi on Saturday. Are we abdicating responsibility to the machine in a charitable context or any other context? Well, it's a really important issue. And the fact that we have general ethical codes doesn't, for me, solve the problem. It becomes a machine-specific, or if you like, AI-specific problem. So I haven't tried to answer all the points. I very much welcome the speeches that have been made. They've been really useful and interesting. But I think it's fair to say that we have identified a small number of very specific AI ethical issues, and therefore I would urge you to vote against the motion.
Thank you, Chris.
Can I stand over there? Is that all right?
You may.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, I mean, the stakes are quite high. So I should explain that Chris is a former president of the BCS. He's just stopped doing that, and he devoted most of his presidency to talking about this issue. And he confided to me before that if he lost this debate, essentially he'd wasted a year of his life on this matter. So the stakes are high for him. And for me, of course, I was astonished to discover I was in the majority at the beginning of this debate, because I certainly wasn't expecting to be. I was always thought of myself as an outrageous outlier. And so now I face the horrible prospect of being one of those people who manages to convert a thumping majority into a tiny minority just by dint of speaking to you. You know, so there are personal.
Richard, there's plenty of precedent somewhere in the house.
But there are personal high stakes here now. But of course, there are really high stakes for some of the people in the audience, because they're trying to deploy AI in the most difficult situations. And I thought quickly I would return, because I'm meant to be rebutting things, I think. I'm going to return to Chris's 6 points. These 6 points are quite well known in the industry, and they are probably a useful checklist, I would say, for checking your own systems and saying, right, are we clean on all of these things? So whatever we disagree on, I wouldn't disagree that they're a useful checklist. The only issue is, you've already mentioned, Chris, the great issue, legislation and regulation, is it's always yesterday's issue, you know. So bias was the first one, and the old trope came out about the racist face detection system. So really wonderful videos made of this by a lady at MIT.
Joy Boylamwini.
Joy Boylamwini, yeah. What she doesn't tell you is she's looking at a face detector from OpenCV that I was sort of working on when I was a graduate student. I'm 50 now. So it's 20 years old, that face detector. You can download and use it. So her point is, a face detector that is probably 20 years old is racist. Well, yeah. The modern ones aren't. Could AI be biased? Yes, it can be. Are there tests out there now being developed to stop that bias? Yes, IBM have a very good bias toolkit. You can download and use it. It will check your own AI for bias against the protected characteristics. Unlike human bias, you can measure it, you can test it, and you can retrain it. So, yeah, you should watch for bias. Always an issue. Is it a serious, life-threatening, worrying issue that won't get solved? No. Right, AI destroys jobs was the second one. Yeah, well, the Victorians were saying that about steam trains. I don't think there's any evidence it destroys jobs. It probably creates jobs. I was sort of longing for the AI revolution to reduce my workload. It certainly hasn't. I seem to be working harder and harder. So I'm not really sure what to make of that. I feel it's unlikely, but there we go. Harmlessness. Yeah, AI should be harmless, and all of this sort of horror about lethal weapons, self-guided lethal weapons, targeting people in a very indiscriminate way. Obviously a big worry. I don't know if you're aware, but the Royal Navy has been... no, let's not say the Royal Navy, because I'm not sure that's quite true. There are navies around the world that already have had autonomous torpedoes. They are at least 30 years old, and they are already covered by the Geneva Convention on Warfare, and you can imagine what happens when they go bang near things that they shouldn't go bang on. A war crime has been committed, and who is to blame? Well, the law is very clear on these things. If you're going to launch indiscriminately weapons that self-guide and self-target, then you are to blame. Easy. Is it wise to produce AI that does that? No. Should you produce it? No. Is it already covered by your existing ethical frameworks? Yeah. Now, what was the fourth one? Who is responsible when things go wrong? I didn't hear a really compelling answer to that, in the sense that I thought about the airbag example, which is years out of date. We were able to find out who went wrong there. It was either designer, the operator, or the user, and the courts have to decide. Does it involve anything great big dramatic rethinking of the way we think about the law or ethics? I don't think so. AI impersonating human beings. So the Google, I don't know if anyone's listened to the Google transcript. It's great fun, you know, and creepy. I would agree with you know, and somewhat exploitative and worrying. You know, Google call up these perfectly innocent people and make dinner reservations. But of course, robot chatbots have been doing this for at least 15 years before this point, without telling you that they were robot chatbots. So I don't really think that we sort of crossed a line there, in the sense, if a line was crossed, it was crossed many years ago. Whether it is ethical or not depends entirely on the context, as the gentleman out here implied. What I'm hearing from this audience is we don't think it's appropriate to have chatbots impersonating humans. Thank you very much. Fine. Don't let them then. That's what I would say to that. Already covered. And explainability. This is the bogeyman of AI. It's not explainable. Well, one, let's just ignore the fact that you're not explainable, I'm not explainable. I mean, I am no more explainable in my bizarre thinking than a robot. In fact, I'm considerably less explainable than that. But you seem to cope with my eccentricities and lunacies as they come. So that's one issue. Two, there's a massive research program going on at the moment to make particularly deep learning explainable and transparent to people. It's really a huge concern of technologists, and I really feel that this will feel like yesterday's issue, almost yesterday. You know, it's going to get solved very, very fast. So the 6 issues I thoroughly agree with as a very useful checklist of your own deployment. No question with that at all. Does it mean that you have to engage in moral panic and anxiety about what AI is going to do for you in your world? Certainly not. What you should do is embrace it and love AI, because it's going to change your business entirely for the better. Thank you.
Excellent. Gosh, I've got quite a few pictures in my mind now about the illustrious career hangs in the balance, a year's worth of work.
What about my oratory skills, which are guaranteed to be proved wanting, I think?
Well, I'm going to be thinking about your eccentricities for quite some time to come. But now this comes to the crux of the matter, the crucial moment. So I hope you've all got a red and a green card with you. There are some spares if you haven't. And if you remember, the motion that we're going to vote on is there's no such thing as AI ethics, just ethics. Now, if you agree with that, could you please hold up a green card? Wow, let's count these. Can you count these from the back? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. Yeah. And if you disagree with that, could you hold up a red one, please? 9.
That's the question.
Yes.
Did all the charities vote red?
Yeah, so let's see the charity vote then.
Oh, do you want to see the charities? How do you feel about voting separately? So, would the charities like to vote?
I'm just curious.
Oh, I see.
Oh.
Good. Good.
Yeah.
64.
Interesting. Yeah.
Green to red or red to green?
Green to red. So the answers we have now this evening, before we heard from everybody in the room, we had 25 votes for green to agree with this house. After all our conversations, we now have 28. Before we had 8 people, 8 red votes, and now we have 9. I'm sorry. I'm very sorry about this. And if you didn't get the charity vote, it was 6-4 green to red. 6-5. Oh, 6-5.
Yeah.
So that's really close.
So both sides have increased their vote.
Yes. So before
Who didn't vote the first time?
people had made up their minds.
They haven't made up their minds, or they did. They voted twice.
Well, I hope you've all enjoyed this evening, and I hope that this has given you something to think about on the way home and perhaps take forward in the future. I've certainly learnt a lot, and I think there's been a lot of points covered, and some of them have been funny, and some of them have been very insightful. I think we owe it to thank everybody who's spoken, but particularly our speakers. So if I could ask you to put your hands together and say thank you both very much. And if any of you have got a few more minutes left and you'd like to join me in what's known as a stirrup cup, then we still have some glasses out there. You're very much welcome to join me in another glass before you go. But other than that, I can just say thank you all very much for coming. Thank you.